Hello and welcome back to the Godot community. My name is Sahira Dean. I'm the virtual PLC lead for high school 2D art. In today's webinar, I'm going to demo some experimental techniques that will be helpful in presenting journals to your students. So what I like to do is present a new technique or two, or maybe even three sometimes, for each journal topic. That way students are encouraged to experiment, and a lot of times they'll carry these experimental techniques into their work that they, their projects and their personal work that they do for class. So I'm going to switch my screen over to my desk. All right, so the first really cool technique that students usually really love is an image transfer. Now, of course, this isn't the only way to do an image transfer. You can use Mod Podge, you can use wintergreen alcohol, you can use special markers that they actually sell in the store. But this one allows just a little bit more versatility in using the image. And then, you know, it's a lot, in my opinion, a little more clean of an image transfer. So I typically do this one with the first entry that we do for the year. So it's the entry that's about them. So I'll ask them to bring in a picture of themselves or something, a picture that they've taken, maybe that best illustrates them and their personality, so on and so forth. So I've already printed out a picture. This is actually a picture from my garden. It's a sweet pea flower. And I have some tape that I am going to put on the image. This is just regular clear packing tape. So you do want to make sure that the paper is free of any debris, just because that will interfere with the image transfer. So I'm going to take the tape, carefully place it so it's nice and flat. I'm just going to use some scissors to kind of burnish the image onto the tape. So I'm trying to prevent any air bubbles, and I'm also making sure that the image has contact with the tape. So I'm going to take my second piece of tape and I'm going to overlap it just a little bit. If I were to leave it a space, would I put it in the water, which is the next step, the paper would rip on that space. Okay, so I'm just going to burnish again. Again, my last piece of tape. So obviously you can use this, like you don't have to actually use the whole image. You can cut out just the part that you want. You can do multiple transfers, so on and so forth. So a lot of possibilities here with this technique. Okay. So the next step would be to soak it in water, just regular room temperature water. Hot water works a little bit faster. Just for the sake of time, I have one that I've already pre-soaked and I've actually started rubbing off the back. You can see some of the paper. So I just have a piece of cardboard, just because this can get a little messy. You're just going to take your finger and go in a circular motion and start rubbing off the paper. Now keep in mind, you know, students will, if they have an image that has a lot of highlights or a lot of white in their photograph, that it's going to take off a majority of the image. So image quality, in terms of having a nice range of grays and blacks, is important to if you're going to use this technique, because otherwise your image is going to be very faint, very light. You know, so keep that in mind in terms of choosing an image, right? So it's pulling out all the white, very light gray areas, and just leaving the gray and black values, right? So when I go and put this on my journal, you'll see the image pop forward, right? So this has a lot of possibilities in terms of layering. Maybe there's some text behind there. Maybe there is some another image behind there. Of course, you can work on top of it, keeping in mind that this is a plastic tape on top. So experimenting with what materials work best, right? So there's that, and this will, like when it dries, it will stick. You can kind of hear that one sticking once it dries. Okay, so there's a image transfer just using packing tape. Another technique I wanted to show you, just gonna scoot that to the side, is experimenting with watercolor pencils. I'm just grabbing some materials here. So I have just a basic watercolor set here. I have some watercolor pencils. Now, any watercolor pencil will do. And then some sandpaper or a sanding block. Even an X-Acto knife, you can use that as well. So all I'm going to do is wet the paper a little bit. I'll take a light color just so you can hopefully see it a little bit better. And then I'm going to take my color pencil and the piece of sanding block, and I'm just going to sand that into the wet areas, right? So you can see the color pencil, the watercolor pencil reacting. So it creates like kind of these bursts into the watercolor, right? So a lot of possibilities for texture and things like that. And of course, it will stick as long as it is wet once it's there. So one idea, if you have inherited a bunch of random stencils, might be to take the stencil, right, and the sandpaper and your color pencil, and sand directly over that to maybe create an interesting design. Okay, so watercolor pencils, just regular watercolor, and just think about different possibilities you can do with that. Students are really usually intrigued by that one. You'll get a lot of ooh ahs with that one. Another one is to take some bubbles. This was a fun one to do also. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of ink, Indian ink in there, into the bubbles. So you can do this with watercolor. Also, it'll work just the same. I haven't tried it with paint. I would think paint might be too thick, but you can definitely experiment and see what happens. So you'll take the bubbles and just kind of blow it onto, and you'll know if you have enough ink, whether it works or not. So I'm gonna add a little bit more ink into here. There we go. The idea is to get some circular formations with the combination of the ink and the bubbles. Right, so you can kind of see one there. So this might be a cool experiment for maybe, you can't touch the paper for part of this. What else can you do by not physically touching the paper? How else can you make a mark? Right, so it could be an interesting assignment. Very unpredictable, because as you'll see, you'll get some splatter also, but you can get some really interesting formations with the bubbles and the ink. Okay. One other thing to keep in mind, if you do not have like a bunch of bubbles, don't go out and buy a bunch of bubbles. You can easily find recipes online to make your own. Okay. A couple other things I just wanted to show. If you teach printmaking, or maybe you have know someone that laid the floor, maybe they have some extra linoleum, you can make your own stamps, right? So Adinkra symbols, or maybe logos, a signature logo that the student makes, maybe they put that on every page of their journal. Could be really interesting. And you can carve these, of course, with carving tools, but you can also use like X-Acto knives and things like that. Okay, so linoleum, um, keeping different things to make textures, right? So if I took this and some paint and did some stamping, I could do that. Or maybe I put it behind my paper to bring out some texture from the shell, right? I can do that as well. So having just a bunch of random knickknacks, like in my classroom, I have a craft drawer. In there, there's like sewing needles, there's popsicle sticks, just random things I find that might be helpful. Um, Flyers could be really interesting to kind of like if you're thinking about a journal that highlights a weekend or maybe an adventure. My favorite gum, I've kept those wrappers, right? A box or two. Um, Now, this doesn't make you a hoarder, right? So keep that in mind. It just makes you, we're teachers, we're art teachers, and we tend to collect a lot of things. Um, and you'll be surprised how much of that gets used throughout the year, especially if you encourage students to use it. One other thing I wanted to say is maybe there's a journal entry where you encourage students to, like they can't use glue or adhesive, but maybe they sew everything into their journal, right? So keeping some sewing thread and needles around is really important, just to kind of encourage them other ways to create in their journal entries. All right, one other thing I want to show you is just using regular graphite sticks. So these are, they react really interesting in water, right? So you'll get almost like a, I don't know, it's just an interesting type of line. It's a lot more smooth, drawing it through watercolor and just regular water. So all I'm doing is zipping into the water that I have and going in and making some marks, right? So just to show you the difference in line with water and without water, right? So with water and without water, you can get some interesting, let me turn that just a little bit so you can see because there's a little glare. I'll just move the book over, right? So with water and without water, a lot more saturation, a little more interesting values that you can kind of get with just the additional water. Kind of interesting. All right, alcohol is actually something else that's interesting to keep around your classroom as well. Not only for, just those random accidents that might happen, but, for experimenting with in watercolor. So this also, like you can experiment with this in Sharpie. It makes an interesting effect with Sharpie markers as well. So stamps is the last thing I want to talk about. Usually there are some stamps maybe that people don't want online or maybe other teachers. So you can definitely think of creative ways to, because this is interesting. It could be interesting letter design that they add in addition to the stamps that they might create. Your more crafty stamps, you can use those as well. But just make sure you emphasize that if they use these pre-made ones, that it's something that they build on top of, not that they just come in and just stamp. Otherwise, it'll look a little more scrapbooky as opposed to more artistically created visual verbal journals. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope you got some inspiration from the experimental techniques that we went over today. Please do join us on the Godot community. Join me on the high school 2D art community where we can take part in more discussions, bounce ideas off each other, ask questions, and we can definitely interact with teachers from all across the state of Georgia. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.